so much for joining me today. We are beginning our study of the book of Jeremiah, and we'll be looking at chapter 1. Will you pray with me as we begin? God, I thank you so much for today, and I thank you for your word. We thank you for these words you spoke through Jeremiah all of those centuries ago, and I pray that as we dive deeply into this book, that you will speak to us, you will transform us and form us into better followers of you, God. And I pray, Jesus, that we just thank you for your love, and we pray all of this in your holy and precious name. Amen. So for this summer, we are going to study Jeremiah, and we'll get to Lamentations for 1 week at the end, but we are really diving into the book of Jeremiah. And I encourage you to go and watch the intro video because I give a little bit of the historical context and just a really general overview of some things to expect and just about the book itself in that video. So I encourage you to go and watch that. We are going to read through this first chapter though, and as we look through it, we really can divide it into 3 parts because it functions very much like an introduction to the scroll of Jeremiah. So the first 3 verses will be the first part, and they function more like a preface. Some third-person biographical chronological information that tells us who and what and where. And it helps us set this book in context historically. Then our second section really is verses 4 through 10. And this deals very much with the call of Jeremiah. It is a first-person account. So Jeremiah is describing his call, what God said to him and how that happened. And then if we look starting in verse 11 and going through verse 19, we have 2 oracles and a further confirmation and preparation of Jeremiah for the road ahead. So these oracles can be very much can be viewed as confirmation of Jeremiah's call, and then we get a restating of that call at the end of the chapter. So let's look here at these first 3 verses. It'd be really easy to just skip over them because, it's just biographical and chronological historical type information. But I think there's some important things here to help us as we interpret the rest of this book. So let's look at these 3 verses. We see that we're told about who. So Jeremiah, these are the words of Jeremiah. He's the son of Hilkiah, who was one of the priests at Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. So we find out about Jeremiah's family in this first verse. Now, Anathoth was a small village within walking distance of Jerusalem, about 3 miles north, and it was set aside for the Levites within the land of the tribe of Benjamin. So the Levites were the priestly class, and they didn't have an allotment in the kingdom of Israel for their own land. They were given cities and land in each of the different tribal lands. And this also was the ancestral home of Abiathar, the priest, and he was a priest during the time of David, King David, and Solomon. He, though, backed Adonijah, who was one of David's sons, to be king over Solomon. And so Solomon banished him to Anathoth. And if you want to read that story, go and look at 1 Kings 2. And so scholars have wondered, was Jeremiah from this line of priests? So Abiathar was kind of displaced as priest and in favor of Zadok. So Jeremiah might have been from that line. He was definitely from the same city, but we don't know. But he was from a priestly family who lived in that region. The next thing that we are told is the word of the Lord came to him. So the word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But the next thing we see after that is some kings. We see Josiah mentioned, we see Jehoiakim, and we see Zedekiah. All 3 of these kings are mentioned, and it help us get a picture of when this happened. So the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, scholars estimate this to be around 627 BC. So this means that Jeremiah would have been born during the reign of Josiah's father Manasseh, who was a very terrible king. And then he received this call to prophesy and be a prophet for God around 627 BC during the reign of Josiah. And he would have prophesied about 40 years, because that would have taken us down to the rule of Zedekiah. And he was the last king who was ruling whenever Babylon rose to power and defeated Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem and took the people off to exile in 587 BC. So we can say that Jeremiah had a roughly 40-year time of ministry, and he ministered and prophesied to the people of Judah during the last days of the kingdom of Judah. So these kings represented good and bad. Josiah was faithful to God. Jehoiakim and Zedekiah were not, and they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. That's what we were told in 2 Kings. But this sets the framework for what we're going to see. This book has a very political nature to it. There's a political nature to the message. Jeremiah is going to be interacting with Jehoiakim and Zedekiah specifically in the midst of this message. And we'll see that as we read through. And Jeremiah is going to be a very controversial figure. His message is going to be not accepted. He will be rejected, and he's going to be mistreated, as we will see as we dive into this book. Another thing, though, that we can take from these opening verses is that Jeremiah spoke the word of the Lord. It says the word of the Lord came to him. He received this call, and he speaks the word of the Lord. What is going to follow is the word of the Lord that God gave to Jeremiah, and he speaks these words over 40 years of ministry. And we're going to see this word, the word of the Lord, and its impact on the priests and the kings and the prophets and the people of Judah as we read through this book. And then a final thing that we see here is that his ministry lasts until the people of Jerusalem are taken into exile in Babylon. That is at the end of verse 3. And it's interesting because we are told the end of the story at the beginning. What we're going to read a lot of is a lot of judgment against Judah for their idolatry and their unfaithfulness to God. We know where this story is going. But if we were to flip to the end, to chapter 52, we'll see here, look at chapter 52, verse 27. It says, so Judah went into captivity away from her land. So the book is going to end with this captivity, right? They are going to be sent off, and then we're told like who was taken into exile and the number of people and all of that. But that is where we're headed. So there's no doubt about what's going to happen at the end of this. Judah will be ultimately judged for being unfaithful to God and breaking that covenant. So these first three verses, though they seem very informational, also help us as we interpret and understand the message that follows. So let's go ahead now and turn our attention to the call of Jeremiah, his appointment as prophet. So let's look starting in verse 4, and I'm going to read a few verses and we'll talk about him. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. But the Lord said to me, do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. So God calls Jeremiah, appoints him to be a prophet. And it's so interesting because he goes all the way back before Jeremiah was even born. And this is just pointing out God's sovereignty and God's perspective on this whole situation in Judah. His perspective is much bigger than the present moment. Before Jeremiah was born, God knew him and appointed him to be this prophet to the nations. So we see here in these first verses, this first call that God is broadening Jeremiah's horizons. We don't know much at all about Jeremiah's plans or life goals before this happened, but we do know that once God called him, he couldn't escape it. And he he had to fulfill this. So God is sovereign. He called him before his birth. God called him to be a part of this divine purpose in giving this message to the people of Judah. And Jeremiah's selection to be this prophet had nothing to do with his merit. It was before he was even born, before he had a chance to be good enough or anything. God called him and appointed him to be the prophet. He was chosen and he was set apart by God. But then we see Jeremiah immediately come back and say, but God, he gives an objection. I am too young. I don't know how to speak and I am too young. Now we think that Jeremiah would have been late teens, maybe up to about the age of 20. And so he is saying that he is not mature enough. He hasn't had enough life experience. But God responds by saying, don't say you're too young. He says you are young. That's a fact. It's not deniable. But you're called to go to whomever I send you and to say whatever it is I tell you to say. So there's this openness in what God is calling Jeremiah to do. Jeremiah is not told you're going to go to this specific person and say this specific thing. God's saying you're going to go wherever I send you, to whomever I send you, and say whatever it is I tell you to say. What God is telling him to do is what matters. Not is he old enough or young enough? Does he have enough experience? We have Jeremiah being called to an unlimited mission with an unlimited message. That would be quite a bit overwhelming. I don't know about you. That's what I would think. It's like, okay, that's pretty open-ended, God. Like, what are you thinking here? What are we going to do? But then God gives him a promise. And he says, don't be afraid because I am with you. I will rescue you. And honestly, this reminds me a lot of Joshua. If you remember back to Joshua 1, when Joshua is he is right there. He's about to lead the people into the promised land. And God says, have I not commanded you to be strong and courageous? Don't be terrified. Don't be discouraged because the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And he reiterates that to Joshua a lot. And that reminds me a lot of that here. God talking to Jeremiah here. Don't be afraid because I am with you. This promise of God's presence is to be with him in the midst of everything that is going to come is huge. God was present with his people. God is a tabernacling God who does life with his people. And he is going to do life with Jeremiah and be with him at every step of the way. And we know Jeremiah is going to need that promise because Jeremiah is going to face a lot of hard situations. Being rejected, being disowned, being thrown in prison, being threatened, all sorts of things. He is going to face these things, but he will not do it alone. God will be with him. And what's more, God will rescue him. He can trust that God loves him and will take care of him and be with him. And then the next part of this story is looking at verse 9. It says, then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. And God is reaching out and touching him. We see this tangible aspect to this call. So we don't know, was this a vision? What exactly was this? But there is something tangible that happens. God touches his mouth as I put my words in your mouth. Jeremiah is going to speak God's words. God is going to speak through him. So for the people to hear Jeremiah speak will be as if the people are hearing God speak. And we know that his message will be rejected. They're going to prefer the comforting messages that the other prophets are willing to give. But God is going to speak through Jeremiah, this very human prophet. He's going to speak through him. Jeremiah is going to be God's mouthpiece. And he is going to have prophetic authority, where he's going to go to these people and speak this message. And then God says, you're going to uproot and tear down, destroy and overthrow, build and plant. And we see mostly negative words here, words of destruction. We hear words of agriculture with uprooting and planting, words of construction, tearing down and building, and words of warfare, destroying and overthrowing. There's going to be this destructive note to these messages. There's going to be a destructive task to these messages, tearing down Judah's idolatry and unfaithfulness. But also there will be a constructive message of hope. And we'll see that. We'll get there later in the book, in the second half. There will be building. There will be planting. The catastrophe that is to come is not the end. It will prepare a way for a new beginning that will defy logic and will be only made possible by God's grace. And after this call that we see here in verses 4 through 10, God gives confirmation of this call through two visions. This is verses 11 through 19. And we don't know if these visions come right on the heels of this call, like at the same time, or if it was a little bit later. I tend to think a little bit later because it says the word of the Lord came to me, so it's coming to him again. And he says, "What do you see, Jeremiah?" And he says, "I see a branch of an almond tree." And what we have here is a sign for Jeremiah. He's standing there, he's looking at an almond tree, he sees a branch. And there is a play on words here in the Hebrew. For the word for almond tree sounds very similar to the word for to watch. So God is watching over the word that he wants Jeremiah to preach, to watch and make sure that it is fulfilled. And so every time Jeremiah sees this almond branch, he could be reminded that God is at work. God is at work fulfilling and watching over his word. And then the other vision he gives Jeremiah is this vision of a boiling pot. It starts down here in verse 13. But it's a boiling pot that is tilting over, about to spill all of its contents out. And it says it's tilting toward us from the north. This is a message that the enemy is building in the north. The enemy is building, and God's judgment is going to come for the people's wickedness. This is going to be the Lord's doing. This isn't some random act. This is going to be punishment for Judah's idolatry, for their breach of the covenant they made with God at Mount Sinai. And so then finally, verse 17, let's look at that. We're going to read 17 through 19. It says, "Get ready. Stand up and say to them whatever I command you. Do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them. Today I have made you a fortified city, an iron pillar, and a bronze wall to stand against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. They will fight against you, but will not overcome you. For I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord." So we see God reiterating the call, reiterating the promise to be with him, to be with Jeremiah, to rescue him. And also a warning. Hey, you better carry this out. This is something you are called to do. You can't not do it. Be ready. A little bit more reminiscent of Joshua again, that calling to be courageous and strong. A call to stand firm, to be God's mouthpiece, to say whatever God has for him without fear and without retreat. And so the scroll of Jeremiah begins. I think it's going to be a very interesting study. I'm excited about it. There's just a lot in Jeremiah that we can think about and think deeply about. So I hope that you will take the time to read Jeremiah on your own. We are not going to have time to go through it at the same pace we went through the book of John. We won't be able to talk about every single verse, but we will be able to paint with some broad brush strokes and talk about some different sections. And hopefully this will be a meaningful study for you. So I'll see you next week. Bye.